The frost-hardened snow of Lublin bit through the worn soles of Private First-Class Vasily Golovnya's boots. It was July 1944. The Red Army had moved with a terrifying, unrelenting pace, shattering the remnants of Army Group Center, and now, they found themselves not in the chaos of battle, but in a silence that felt heavier than any artillery barrage. They had been told to secure a large industrial complex on the city's outskirts, a place marked only as Prisoner of War Camp 2 on outdated intelligence maps. As they approached, the stench hit them first, a sickly, sweet, chemical smell that clung to the air, an odor that made seasoned veterans recoil. Vasily's platoon slowed, their mud-soaked boots slipping on the frozen ruts of a long, dark dirt road. Above the camp, an impossibly tall wooden watchtower stood guard, empty now, a silent, skeletal finger pointing at the gray eastern sky. The gates, made of cold iron bars, were inexplicably open, ajar, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. There was no one to greet them, no guards, no sound of prisoners cheering. Just the wind whistling through 3 rows of high, taut barbed wire, a sound like a sustained, mournful whisper. Vasily, gripping his submachine gun, was the first to step across the threshold. The ground underfoot was strangely compacted, not earth, but a fine, gray powder, scattered lightly like a perpetual, unnatural ashfall. The complex was vast, endless lines of low, wooden barracks, each a twin of the last, standing shoulder to shoulder under the bleak sky. He saw a pile of discarded children's shoes, small, leather forms curled as if still protecting tiny feet. Then, a massive heap of spectacles, the lenses staring blankly at the sky. Finally, he saw the building, set slightly apart, made of heavy stone, with a chimney that was still faintly warm to the touch. Inside, the walls were streaked a dark, ominous blue. This was the moment the war changed for Vasily, the moment the reality of what the concentration camps truly were, what the Einsatzgruppen had been covering up in the forests and ravines for years, slammed into his soul with the force of a train. The brutality they had imagined was only a fraction of the incomprehensible horror they now walked through. He reached into his tunic pocket, his fingers brushing the small, leather-bound diary he had salvaged from a fallen medic near Minsk. Its pages, filled with desperate accounts of courage and loss, seemed suddenly trivial compared to the silence that reigned here, a silence that swallowed hope whole. The raw, unfiltered truth of these moments, of the fear, the moral shock, and the impossible bravery of those who endured it, is often lost to the noise of history. It's in the quiet spaces, the forgotten diary excerpts, and the long silent voices of the survivors that the true weight of the past rests. If the exploration of this psychological burden, of the sheer human cost of war's darkest corners, matters to you, consider joining us in this somber journey. These stories need to be remembered, not for glorification, but for the profound empathy they demand. The discovery of the camp's machinery, the ovens, the gas chambers, the vast, echoing storehouses of stolen human possessions, did not just introduce Vasily Golovnya and his comrades to death, it introduced them to a new, industrial form of evil, a planned extermination that defied the very definition of warfare. Yet, the story of this specific, chilling silence, the stillness that pervaded the newly liberated Majdanek, began much earlier, many hundreds of miles to the north and west, within the hastily constructed, impossibly crowded confines of the Jewish ghettos. These were not just prisons, they were laboratories of psychological disintegration, designed to crush the human spirit long before the ultimate, inevitable transport arrived. In the heart of Warsaw, the ghetto walls, high, dirty bricks separating 1 million people from the outside world, became a stage for an insidious form of psychological warfare. The constant, gnawing hunger, the rampant typhus, the relentless cold that seeped into the thin floorboards of every apartment, were deliberate weapons wielded not with a rifle, but with an order signed in a comfortable office miles away. Consider the life of Elena Roth, a 15-year-old girl in the Warsaw Ghetto, whose world shrank daily to the perimeter of her single, freezing room, shared with 8 other souls. Her diary, a collection of scraps of paper bound with twine, spoke not of dramatic uprisings, but of the mundane, relentless cruelty of scarcity. She wrote of the silence of her father, a formerly jovial tailor, who had stopped humming entirely, his face a mask of permanent, exhausted worry. The Germans didn't need to physically assault the residents every hour, the constant uncertainty, the rumors of actions, the sudden disappearances of neighbors in the night, the sheer impossibility of securing a piece of stale bread, was enough to generate a paralyzing, collective fear. This fear was the psychological anchor of the Nazi strategy, to atomize the community, to turn every moment into a negotiation for basic survival, thus eroding the will to resist. The occasional, loud, random acts of brutality by the SS patrols were merely pattern interrupts designed to reinforce the fragility of life, punctuating the grinding monotony of starvation with sudden, shocking terror. The establishment of the ghettos was the first, critical phase in the Endlösung, the final solution. It was a meticulous process of dehumanization, starting with the forced wearing of the Star of David, a deliberate, public branding designed to sever social connections and isolate the victims. This segregation was rapidly followed by economic strangulation. Imagine the intellectual class, doctors, lawyers, professors, now forced to toil in German workshops, their highly educated hands performing meaningless, backbreaking tasks for scraps of food, while their children withered from malnutrition. The degradation was systematic, a psychological assault aimed at stripping away identity, dignity, and purpose. It was not enough to merely imprison them, their existence had to be rendered meaningless in their own eyes. The smell of unwashed bodies, the sickness that spread like wildfire through the air, the constant drone of official typewriter clicking in war crime offices processing the next set of impossible demands, all contributed to an atmosphere of pervasive, inescapable misery. In the midst of this darkness, small, extraordinary acts of resistance emerged, not of violence, but of profound human dignity. In the Lodz ghetto, despite the omnipresent hunger, secret schools continued to operate, history and poetry whispered to huddled groups of children in freezing basements. The determination to retain culture, to teach a child a line of forgotten verse, to secretly celebrate a Sabbath that was forbidden under pain of death, this was the true counterattack against the psychological warfare. It was a refusal to surrender the internal landscape, the soul, even when the body was being preservation were lifelines, small, flickering candles in the vast, overwhelming darkness. Yet, even these moments were often drowned out by the escalating terror. The sheer volume of suffering, the constant presence of death in the streets, made the maintenance of hope an almost superhuman effort. The final act of the ghetto phase was the liquidation, the forced, brutal transports to the concentration camps. This was the moment of ultimate psychological rupture, the sudden, violent shattering of any remaining illusions of safety. For Elena Roth, that moment came in mid-1942. The air was filled with the guttural shouts of the SS, the barking of dogs, and the terrifying, incessant sound of truck engines. As she was shoved into a cattle car, crammed so tightly she couldn't move her arms, she looked back at the high brick wall that had been her entire world for 3 years. She saw a single patch of faded graffiti, a child's drawing of a sun, painted long ago. It was immediately, violently erased from her mind by the cold, iron clang of the door sealing her in. The journey itself was a continuation of the psychological torture, days without water, standing in human waste, the smell of fear and sickness so thick it was a physical presence. This was not a ride to a labor camp, this was a passage into the machinery of oblivion, a transition from the slow, deliberate death of the ghetto to the swift, industrial death awaiting them at the terminus. The silence in that cattle car, Elena later wrote in a salvaged fragment, was not empty, it was filled with the terrifying realization of absolute surrender, not to the guards, but to the crushing weight of fate. As Vasily Golovnya stood among the ashes of Majdanek, he could sense the ghosts of these earlier struggles. He realized that the sheer inhumanity of the camp was not a singular event, but the horrific culmination of a campaign that began in the cramped, desperate streets of the ghettos. The cold logic that designed the gas chambers was the same logic that first denied a child a crust of bread. It was a progression of cruelty, a slow, methodical chipping away at the sanctity of life. He picked up a small, hand-stitched doll, left near the gate, its face stained with what looked like dried tears. He wondered about the child who owned it, the last flicker of innocence they might have held onto as they passed through the cold iron bars of the camp gate. He looked at the vast, desolate landscape of the extermination site and understood that the moral injury inflicted here was not just on the victims, but on the very concept of humanity. How could men orchestrate such a relentless, planned psychological and physical destruction? This chilling, systematic brutality forces a question to the surface, a question that lingers long after the smell of burning documents has dissipated. if the ghettos were designed to destroy the will to live, and the camps to destroy life itself, where did the last, desperate sparks of human spirit go, and how did they manage to survive the icy grip of the Eastern Front, where another, equally brutal kind of psychological warfare was raging? The psychological landscape of the Eastern Front offered a terrifying counterpoint to the calculated, industrial cruelty of the ghettos and camps. Here, the brutality was less surgical, more elemental, a ferocious collision of two diametrically opposed ideologies fought across a frozen, limitless expanse. If the ghettos were about the silence of starvation, the Eastern Front was about the deafening roar of annihilation, underscored by the insidious, soul-crushing terror of the environment itself. The German Wehrmacht, initially driven by the intoxicating speed of the Blitzkrieg, found their psychological armor stripped away by the sheer scale of Russian resistance and the devastating arrival of the Russian winter, the very embodiment of unforgiving nature fighting alongside the Soviet defense. Imagine the German infantryman, Klaus Richter, a veteran of the swift victories in France, now huddled in a makeshift dugout near Stalingrad in late 1942. The temperature had plummeted to $40°/circ/text, C. $. The ground was iron, the wind a physical enemy, and the omnipresent white landscape a form of sensory deprivation. Klaus's war was no longer about glorious conquest, it was a desperate, minute-by-minute battle against frostbite, starvation, and the relentless, chilling knowledge that he was utterly expendable. The mud-soaked boots of the autumn had given way to frozen, useless appendages. The greatest psychological weapon wielded against the German soldier was the cold, a constant, non-negotiable torment that eroded morale more effectively than any Soviet counterattack. The smell was of damp wool, freezing metal, and human despair, a mixture of fear and exhaustion that permeated every trench. The distant, rhythmic thud of Soviet artillery, the dreaded Katyusha rockets, was the organ grinder, a sound that signaled not just physical destruction, but the psychological certainty of impending doom. The Soviet soldier, on the other hand, faced a different, but equally profound psychological ordeal. For them, the war was framed as a life-or-death struggle for Mother Russia, but this nationalism was often underpinned by the terror of the NKVD's disciplinary apparatus. Their psychological warfare was internal, fear of the enemy was often matched by the fear of their own command. Orders were absolute, often suicidal. The legendary stand at the Leningrad siege exemplifies this duality. For 900 days, the civilians and soldiers endured a level of privation that defies comprehension. The hunger was so deep, so profound, that it became the sole focus of existence. Yet, alongside the official propaganda reinforcing their heroic defense, there was the silent, terrifying knowledge that desertion or even expressions of defeatism would result in summary execution by the political commissars. This produced a unique psychological profile, a fierce, almost fanatical resilience born of both ideological commitment and the ultimate penalty for surrender. The true psychological terror was being constantly squeezed between the German firing line and the NKVD's bullet. Interrogation, whether by the Gestapo or Soviet SMRSH, formed another deep scar in the psychological landscape of the war. For captured resistance fighters or downed Allied airmen, the dark, damp, often soundproofed Gestapo interrogation rooms became theaters of pure, mental dread. The methods were rarely solely focused on immediate, brutal violence, they were designed to break the will. The clicking of a typewriter clicking in war crime offices outside the interrogation room, the meticulous, cold logging of every detail, the subtle implication that the captors knew far more than they revealed, these were the refined tools of mental torture. The focus was on isolation, on shattering the prisoner's sense of reality by employing shifting tactics, a sudden offer of a cigarette followed by hours of terrifying silence, a false confession planted to create paranoia, or the chilling, casual mention of a family member's complete psychological exhaustion, where the prisoner would betray their network just to make the relentless mental pressure stop. The fate of Allied POW camps, particularly those under Imperial Japanese control, added yet another layer to the architecture of fear. In Asia, the concept of surrender was considered a deep shame, leading to a level of calculated contempt and systematic cruelty that was both physical and profoundly psychological. The prisoners forced onto the Bataan Death March or incarcerated in camps near the infamous Unit 731 facilities were subjected not just to physical beatings and starvation, but to a continuous campaign of humiliation and degradation designed to strip them of their identity as soldiers and men. The lack of medical care, the impossible labor, the public executions, these weren't just punitive, they were designed to instill a constant, inescapable state of psychic trauma. The psychological damage was not the result of a single, horrific event, but the cumulative effect of months and years of being treated as subhuman, a process that made the eventual freedom feel distant and unreal. The war on the Eastern Front, therefore, was a psychological war waged on three fronts: against the enemy, against the environment, and against one's own side. The endless fighting, the sheer volume of casualties, and the constant awareness of the surrounding inhumanity ground down the souls of the combatants until they were left with a cold, hollow core of survival instinct. The ashes that fell on Vasily Golovnya's uniform at Majdanek were the material proof of a complete ethical failure. The frost that bit into Klaus Richter's hands at Stalingrad was the environmental mirror of that same, absolute failure of humanity. Both theaters, the calculated atrocity and the grinding attrition, demonstrated the catastrophic power of fear as a weapon. Yet, amidst this landscape of total psychological oppression, a secret, resilient counterforce was at work: the resistance networks. These invisible armies, driven by a powerful moral clarity, found a way to not only survive the terror but to actively fight back. How did they maintain their moral compass and their sanity while living under the very shadow of the Gestapo and the SS, transforming pure terror into the fierce determination necessary for sabotage and defiance? The transition from the open terror of the Eastern Front and the suffocating psychological cruelty of the ghettos to the subterranean world of the resistance networks was a shift from public suffering to private, intensely personal peril. Here, the psychological warfare turned inward. The battle was not just against the German occupation, but against suspicion, paranoia, and the overwhelming fear of betrayal. To join the resistance, whether the Polish Armia Krajowa, the French Maquis, or the smaller, scattered partisan units, was to accept a new, pervasive reality where every conversation was potentially overheard, every shadow a potential Gestapo agent. The stakes were absolute, measured in the brutal finality of the firing squad or the slow destruction of the concentration camp. The core psychological challenge for a resistance operative was maintaining a facade of normalcy while living a life of constant, profound deceit. Take for example, Jan Kowalski, a bookbinder in Warsaw, who spent his days repairing worn volumes and his nights printing clandestine newspapers detailing Nazi atrocities. His apartment, outwardly modest, hid a sophisticated radio transmitter used for intercepting radio transmissions and communicating with London. The sensory details of this life were sharp and terrifying: the faint, acrid smell of burning documents during a sudden raid, the faint, metallic click of his own printer in the dead of night, a sound he feared more than artillery, the terrifying, random inspection of his papers by a bored SS guard whose glance could determine life or death. The psychological load of this double life, of loving his wife and family while knowing his activities put them under constant threat, was immense. Every handshake was a risk, every knock on the door, a heart attack. The Gestapo interrogation rooms served as the ultimate test of this double life. The purpose of these brutal sessions was not simply to extract information but to shatter the subject's identity, exploiting the inherent paranoia of clandestine life. Resistance members were trained in techniques of denial and silence, understanding that their survival, and the survival of their entire network, depended on their ability to withstand psychological torment. The methods were insidious: prolonged sleep deprivation, standing in stress positions for hours, and the chilling, cold logic of the interrogator who would meticulously detail the known facts: who, where, what, leaving the prisoner to fill in the blanks, often falsely believing their colleagues had already broken. The goal was to replace moral clarity with exhaustion and despair. The silence in the small, dark room, broken only by the typewriter clicking in war crime offices down the hall, became the most potent weapon, turning the prisoner's own thoughts into torturers. For those involved in complex operations, like sheltering Jews or sabotaging German infrastructure, the emotional cost was incalculable. Irina Sendler, a nurse and social worker, orchestrated the incredible rescue of 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto, smuggling them out in coffins, toolboxes, and sacks. Her success rested on a profound psychological commitment, a deliberate, conscious suppression of fear to make room for immense, focused empathy. She memorized the true names and hiding places of every child, writing them on slips of tissue paper and burying them in jars in a friend's garden, a desperate, defiant act against the Nazis' attempt to erase identity. This action, this meticulous recording of names, was a moral counteract, a psychological refusal to allow the victims to become mere statistics or ashes. The true heroism lay in the daily, grinding internal struggle to override the natural instinct for self-preservation with the absolute moral imperative to save others. The Allied forces recognized that these networks were not just strategic assets but profound moral symbols. The occasional airdrop of supplies, the coded messages transmitted across the airwaves, these were not merely logistical support, they were psychological lifelines, reaffirming that the outside world had not forgotten them. Yet, the cost of failure was always present, haunting their efforts. The brutal reprisals following acts of sabotage, the mass executions, the burning of entire villages and retribution, were themselves acts of psychological terror designed to sever the resistance's support structure among the civilian population. The message was clear: support the resistance, and you invite annihilation. Therefore, were the war's most profound demonstration of the human will to defy psychological oppression. They transformed fear into fuel, suspicion into discipline, and the desperate yearning for freedom into action. They proved that even when surrounded by the physical and psychological architecture of total oppression, a secret, resilient human spirit could continue to fight. But the vast, terrible machinery of the war extended far beyond the European resistance and the Russian front. Across an ocean, in the remote, unforgiving landscapes of Manchuria, an entirely different, chillingly systematic form of scientific brutality was taking place, one that pushed the definition of war crime into the darkest corners of human endeavor. What happened in the medical bunkers of the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 and how did its calculated, coldest experiments in human history reflect a pathology of cruelty unmatched even by the horrors witnessed in Europe? The trajectory of World War II atrocity, when viewed through the psychological lens, arcs violently eastward from the systemic, bureaucratic cruelty of Europe to the profound, unfathomable pathology of Imperial Japan's wartime conduct. The story of Unit 731, stationed in the Pingfang district of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, represents a nadir of human endeavor, a horror not rooted in political expulsion or battlefield necessity, but in a cold, scientific dedication to inflicting suffering. This was not the chaotic brutality of the Eastern Front, nor the administrative sadism of the concentration camps, it was a research program devoted to weaponizing biological agents and maximizing pain, performed on victims chillingly designated as Maryuta, or logs. The atmosphere within the Unit 731 complex was that of a meticulously run scientific facility, not a place of execution. This veneer of professionalism was in itself a profound psychological weapon. Imagine the sight: immaculate laboratories, white coats, sterilized equipment, and the constant, chilling sound of a typewriter clicking in war crime offices, logging the precise temperature, pressure, and biological responses of human beings deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. The sensory experience was one of clinical, terrifying detachment. The victims, Chinese civilians, Russian POWs, and others, were subjected to coldest experiments in human history, designed to test the efficacy of biological weapons by observing the unanesthetized progression of disease. Surgeons performed vivisections while the subjects were still conscious, purely to observe the effect of the infection on internal organs. The psychological dimension of this cruelty was the complete annihilation of the victim's identity and agency under the guise of scientific inquiry. By stripping them of their names and dignity, labeling them Maryuta, the researchers created a moral vacuum where ethical concerns simply ceased to exist. They were not viewed as human beings deserving of empathy, but as disposable biological material for the orders of the Imperial Army. This psychological detachment extended to freezing victims' limbs in sub-zero temperatures and then thawing them with hot water, all to study the treatment of frostbite, a horror reminiscent of the Eastern Front's physical struggles, but here inflicted deliberately, systematically, in the name of science. The victims experienced not just physical agony, but the absolute moral shock of realizing their tormentors were educated men of science, using their knowledge to meticulously document their destruction. This chilling logic of total contempt for human life was not confined to the secrecy of Unit 731's bunkers, it manifested openly in the street-level atrocities during the invasion of China, most infamously during the 6 weeks of terror that followed the fall of Nanking in late 1937. The Nanking streets after the massacre were the visible, chaotic result of a complete breakdown of military discipline and moral restraint. The mass rape, the bayoneting of children, the contests between soldiers to see who could behead the most prisoners, these were acts of psychological terror aimed at shattering the will of the Chinese population and establishing total, crushing dominance. The smell of burning documents and wet uniforms mingled with the stench of death, creating an atmosphere of pervasive, inescapable dread. The cruelty was often interactive and performative, forcing victims to endure humiliation before death, designed to maximize the collective trauma. The sheer volume and public nature of the atrocities ensured that the fear resonated through every corner of the occupied city. The psychological injury here was collective, the trauma of the witness, of the family member forced to watch, of the survivor burdened with the memory of utter moral collapse. Unlike the bureaucratic killing of Europe, the brutality in Nanking was often spontaneous, visceral, and personal, driven by a deeply ingrained militaristic belief in racial superiority and contempt for the concept of surrender. The Imperial Army soldiers were taught that those who surrendered were beneath contempt, leading to the systematic rejection of the laws of war and the basic tenets of humanity. The enduring question that emerges from both the meticulous sadism of Unit 731 and the chaotic brutality of Nanking is one of moral contagion. How did an entire system of military and scientific authority become so pathologically warped that it not only allowed but actively encouraged such sustained, systematic inhumanity? The sheer scale of the psychological violence, the denial of personhood, the calculated infliction of pain, the public spectacle of terror, created wounds that would define generations. The silence that fell over Nanking when the killing finally subsided, and the silence that continues to shroud the secret documents of Unit 731, speak to a deep, terrible moral rupture. This brings us back to the psychological reckoning that awaited those on the side of justice. What happens to the mind of the soldier, the medic, or the journalist when they are suddenly confronted with the physical, undeniable evidence of this scale of evil? What was the psychological effect on the Allied soldiers when they walked into the silence of places like Majdanek and Dachau, and how did they process the horrific reality that lay within the cold iron bars of the catastrophic psychological wave of the war crashed not upon the defeated, but upon the liberators, the soldiers, medics, and journalists who were the first to walk into the silent, reeking evidence of the Holocaust and the Axis war crimes. This was the moment of ultimate moral shock, the sudden, overwhelming confrontation with evil on an unimaginable scale. For the American GIs advancing through Germany, or the Soviet troops penetrating Poland, the sight of a concentration camp, be it Majdanek, Auschwitz, or Dachau, was the definitive, shattering pattern interrupt that redefined their understanding of the war, transforming a conflict over territory into an absolute moral crusade. When the Red Army's Private Vasily Golovnya, whom we left standing amidst the ashes of Majdanek, was joined by his officers, the atmosphere was not one of victorious cheering, but of stunned, horrified silence. The discovery of the camps was a sensory assault. The omnipresent, sickening odor that clung to every uniform, the sight of the surviving prisoners, skeletal, hollow-eyed figures who looked past the soldiers with a terrifying, vacant exhaustion, and the grotesque, meticulously preserved evidence, the piles of human hair, the gold teeth, the mountains of clothes and shoes. Vasily, a man who had seen men blown apart by shells, found himself trembling not from fear of the enemy, but from the visceral, incomprehensible reality of the human capacity for cruelty. The cold iron bars of the camp gate at the moment of liberation became a psychological barrier, separating the soldiers who thought they knew war from the survivors who knew true horror. For the American soldiers, such as the 7th Army troops who reached Dachau in April 1945, the psychological reckoning was instant and overwhelming. They encountered not just the barracks, but the death train, cars filled with the bodies of prisoners starved and shot just days before. The initial reaction among many hardened veterans was a spontaneous, violent moral outrage. Historians document that in the confusion and horror of the initial entry, American troops summarily executed dozens of SS guards and camp personnel, a brief, desperate spasm of vengeance triggered by the unbearable visual evidence of sustained atrocity. This was the moment the moral shock manifested as a desperate attempt to restore equilibrium. For men who had adhered to the laws of war, the sight within the walls was so fundamentally antithetical to their moral framework that the system momentarily broke. The experience of the medics and journalists, often the next wave into the camps, was equally traumatic. They were tasked not with fighting, but with documenting and healing, a near impossible task. The camera lenses focused on the faces of the survivors, recording not just the physical malnutrition but the profound, deep psychological injury. The sheer volume of trauma encountered, the stories of the Einsatzgruppen killings revealed, the accounts of torture in the Gestapo interrogation rooms, the whispered memories of family members vanishing, created a secondary psychological trauma in the listeners. They carried the burden of witness, a dark knowledge that they could never fully convey to the world that had not seen it. The typewriter clicking in war crime offices and makeshift documentation centers now served a new purpose, meticulously recording the evidence for posterity and justice, a desperate effort to ensure the ashes of the victims were not merely erased by time. The psychological impact of liberation was also immense and complicated for the survivors. Freedom did not arrive as a joyous fanfare, but often as a terrifying, disorienting void. Years of constant fear, starvation, and strict orders had rewired their survival instincts. Many were too physically or emotionally broken to comprehend their release. The psychological defense mechanisms that had kept them alive, dissociation, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance, did not simply vanish with the sight of an Allied uniform. For many, the ultimate challenge was not surviving the camp, but learning how to live in a world where such evil had been allowed to flourish. The silence that descended after the gates opened was not the silence of peace, but the quiet immensity of their loss, the profound emptiness left by the murdered millions. Vasily Golovnya left Majdanek a changed man. The battles that followed were still loud, but the sound of the rifle fire could never erase the silence of the barrack rooms. He carried the image of the children's shoes, the empty gas chambers, and the faces of the surviving dead with him for the rest of his life. The war, for him, concluded not with Hitler's death, but with the indelible, haunting knowledge of what man had done to man. The psychological cost of witnessing this brutality was a burden that the liberators, the survivors, and the world itself would carry forever. It is a burden that demands continuous reflection, ensuring that the fear, the trauma, and the chilling silence of war are never forgotten, but understood as a solemn, eternal warning.